So what ends up happening is the image of Obama as kind of like the last gasp of liberal democracy ends up obscuring or masking a global shift toward authoritarianism. And this is what Megan was saying, actually, Professor Francis, I'm sorry, in her introduction. This is a shift that emerged in response to capitalist latest crisis and the mass global resistance movement that emerged in the wake of the crisis. So some of you may remember this. So some of you are old enough to remember 2008, right? Some of you may remember 2009. But 2010 was this explosion, right? Remember that? In 2011. So that whole period you have Occupy, you have Athens and Madrid and Sao Paulo and London and the West Bank, and all these like uprisings that are challenging the sort of the crisis of global capital. So I'm convinced that, you can write this down, that the massive opposition to globalization and to the policies of austerity, there's policies designed to solve capitalism's crisis on the backs of workers, on the backs of the poor, both exposed and hastened the crisis that produced Trump. So Trumpism wasn't just sort of like, bad democratic planning, it was so much more than that. In other words, we could have predicted it, and some people did, had we paid attention, okay? Although I'm very proud to say that, it's sad to say, I was giving a talk at Columbia the week before the elections. I said, Trump's gonna win. And people were like, boo. I said, watch. People still talk about that. It's on film if you don't believe me. Someone filmed it. So to understand, this is what I want to sort of close with, so to understand this current moment that we're in, I think it's worth revisiting. Actually, I put that picture up there. I like this. This is the picture I meant to talk about with respect to the last gasp of liberal democracy. The Obama years, we get nostalgic for them because what we're dealing with is so stupid, right? But there's some terrible things that happened in those days that we kind of forget about. But they look good. But then again, people think George W. Bush is looking good. That's what's amazing to me. Let's just say Reagan's looking good. But anyway, to go back to the story, so to understand this current moment, I think it's worth revisiting Stuart Hall, who also left us not long ago. But Stuart Hall wrote this book in 1988 called The Hard Road to Renewal, Thatcherism and the Crisis of the Left. It's a very, very important collection of essays. And in this collection, he was sort of arguing with British Marxists in the Labour Party. And they took him to task for failing to grasp the way in which popular consent can be mobilized by incorporating popular discontent, and then neutralizing it. So, according to Hall, Thatcherism forged a relationship between free market liberalism and traditional conservative themes like family, nation, patriarchy, respectability, much like Reagan. Themes that emerged in the context of what Hall calls a crisis of national identity and culture precipitated by the unresolved psychic trauma of the end of empire. So in other words, to make Britain great again really meant to restore the old order of Anglo-Saxonism, this racialized patriotism and heteropatriarchal authority. And that's still with us. There's this sort of interesting tension in England right now that's still there. Hall was writing against a group of Labour Party Marxists who really were unable to see how the working class had actually been recomposed in the 20th century. It didn't look the same way as they imagined it. And in fact, it was not unified. It couldn't be unified so easy because it wasn't homogeneous. It was divided. It was divided by race, it was divided by gender, and it was fractured. So a lot of the Marxists acknowledge this, but they see the divides of identity of race and gender, for example, and sexuality as chimeras of false consciousness. And Stuart Hall was like, no, they're not. He says that if we don't actually see the historical trajectory in the formation of identity, it makes it impossible to see class rule as like a single class, not as a single class rather, but as an historic block. Let me just say it again. So he's saying that we make the mistake of thinking of class rule as one class ruling another, the lower class and the upper class, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And he's saying, no, class rule is an historic block that can incorporate both elements of finance capital and industrial capital and elements of the working class. In other words, elements of the working class could participate in class rule, could actually support the ruling class and have a stake in it. And he's saying that there's reasons for that. Some of that stake has to do with things that are considered non-objective, like race. Okay? So in the US, in the 1990s, we see similar attacks taking place from the left on how identity politics undermine class politics. I was involved in some of those debates in those days. Some of the young professors here were like in elementary school at the time when I was fighting those battles with Todd Gitlin and people like that, but that's way back in the past. Some, I could say that some of the people I argued with and debated with in the sort of early 90s, they're dead now and I'm still here, which makes me right. So, actually my grandfather used to say it all the time. He says, you're dead, and I'm here, so I'm right. In any case, to go back, so in the night we see similar attacks, and in some ways, this attack on, from the left, on how identity politics undermine class politics, or its liberal variant, which is that identity politics undermine a unified American identity based on Enlightenment principles of individualism, liberty, and secularism. And lately, we've seen the resurrection of this. We've seen the resurrection of Richard Rorty's 1998 book, Achieving Our Country, which the New York Times had a whole thing about, and in the recent publication of Mark Lilla's The Once and Future Liberal. Now, these and similar critiques, I'm not going to go into details about that, I argue mistake or confuse ideology, that is, a categorical opposition to racism, sexism, homophobia, and institutional oppression and marginalization based on difference, for identity politics. They confuse the two. They think that when you actually have a categorical opposition to these forms of oppression, that is equal to identity politics. Okay? And they presume that the white working class operated purely out of a kind of race and gender neutral economic interest. But all the other people are driven by their race and their gender and their sexuality. So most pundits, of course, repeat this error. They insist that Trump appealed not to white racism, but to legitimate working class populism driven by class anger. But if this were true, then you would think logically that all working people would be attracted to Trump, unless they're just smarter, So you would think, well, Trump would win over all black and brown voters because they're the lowest rungs of the working class. And they suffer disproportionately from some of the policies that he claimed to stand up against, more than whites during the financial crisis of 2008. Instead, Trump's victory inspired a wave of kind of racist attacks and emboldened white nationalists to flaunt their allegiance to the president-elect. So for the liberal critics of identity politics, the real culprits are people of color, the queer people, the feminists, liberal Democrats who alienated the white working class, driving them into the arms of Donald Trump. Now, there are liberal Democrats who alienated all kinds of people just because they're bankrupt, but that's different, that's a different story. And I said it, the Democratic Party is bankrupt, and has been for some time. I didn't realize that literally bankrupt, but we found out that they're literally bankrupt. And I wrote that a year ago. It's going to actually be reprinted in Boston Review, I think tomorrow or the next day, so check it out. They said that, I wrote this piece right after Trump. I stayed up all night, wrote it, in my response, and apparently a lot of stuff that I said, including about Puerto Rico, all turned out to be true. So it turns out I'm right again, you know? What can I say? I'm still living, you know? So they're going to reprint that. But again, instead, you know, these are the people who are seen as the kind of culprits. So this argument that, you know, identity politics and all these people of color and you know, queer people and feminists and stuff are the real sort of problem is an old argument. It's inept, it's confused, and it's very, very old. The movements associated with identity liberalism, as Mark Lillard would have us believe, have actually not been obsessed with narrow group identities, but with forms of oppression. They've been concerned about exclusion. They've been fighting marginalization. And none of these movements today have been exclusionary. Black Lives Matter is not an exclusionary organization, you know? They're wide open. Prison abolitionists, it's not exclusionary. Movements for LGBTQ rights, immigrant rights, reproductive rights, struggles against Islamophobia, these are not exclusive movements. They are serious attempts or serious efforts to interrogate sources of persistent inequality, the barriers to equal opportunity, and the structures and policies that do harm to some groups at the expense of others. The irony, of course, is that the most exclusive organizations are like the Nazis, the alt-right, and the Klan. I've been trying to get in the Klan for years. They will not take my application, right? But all those other organizations I could be a part of, right?